Welcome. My name is Steve Winick. I'm with the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and I'm here with Si Kahn, who is a singer, songwriter, instrumentalist, and political activist, and has been for many years. And we're going to talk to him about many aspects of his career. He took part in our homegrown concert series this year, 2020, and he's also taken part in our Archive Challenge showcases at Folk Alliance International. So we're going to talk to him about those experiences as well. So welcome, Si Kahn.
Steve Winick, I am so happy to be here with you at an appropriately socially distance of several hundred miles. So I think it's okay that we're not wearing masks.
That's right.
But given that we are really old friends, and that I therefore know you'll be really nice to me in the interview, but it's also I was really grateful that the library assigned you to do this interview because we share so much in terms of our musical knowledge and our sense of the usefulness of music in the world. So yeah, really great to see you. And this way we get to talk.
Absolutely. So I guess I'll start by asking maybe it's an obvious question, but which came first for you? Was it political activism, or was it music, or was it like the chicken and the egg? Did they give birth to each other in some way in your head?
Oh no, there's no yes or no answer, and there's no chicken, there's no egg, right?
Right.
So I grew up with music. But I also grew up with my parents' social activism, not mine, my parents. So, my mom was a very fine amateur classical pianist. She loved the Romantics, Schubert, Schumann, all the shoe people, Chopin, and Rachmaninoff. And I would come home from school and there would be mom playing the piano. She was also a wonderful artist in oils and in aquatints, very, very fine line. So I grew up with her music. For the most part, they played opera and classical music. What's the great DC classical station? I can't remember the call letters, but maybe you do. But so I grew up with music, but I also, because Pop is a rabbi, he's been gone for 19 years, but he's still my rabbi. And so I grew up in the synagogue, and this is one of my favorite memories. One time Pop said to me, he said, "How did you become a country and Western singer?" Well, he didn't have the genre exactly, but he was in the neighborhood. And I said, "Well, you taught me." And he said, "I did no such thing." I said, "Hey, Pop, I mean, think about the music of the shul in the synagogue, and what we sang around home, the table at home. First, it was unaccompanied. No instruments. I mean, we were. Pop was Orthodox. He was a conservative rabbi, not politically. He was very progressive politically, but in sort of the divisions within the Jewish community, the religious divisions. His personal practice leaned towards orthodoxy, but his family was a family of chazonim, of cantors, and Pop was a wonderful singer. So unlike the Reform and Reconstructionist congregations, we didn't have organs, we didn't have guitars or banjos or ouds or anything like that. So I grew up learning to sing unaccompanied. I said, so Pop, first, that's the first thing. Secondly, the music that we sang, both the liturgical music and the occasional Yiddish folk song and the Hebrew folk songs, we sang them a cappella. They're highly embellished. Right? So you don't just sing a note, you quaver it, you waver it, you tremolo it, and we lots of slides from one note to another. And I said, Pop, I know you don't know this, but that's called the high lonesome sound, right? And I'm quite serious about this. I was corresponding with some British musicians, the Young'uns, just great a cappella trio. And we were talking about singing a cappella, and it's the spontaneous harmonizing. I don't figure out what the harmony is in advance. I just do the harmony. It's so I think that I'm just going to damp the incoming sound so we don't get interrupted. Okay, you guys can edit that out. So that's so I really did grow up surrounded by music, singing music, practicing music. Now I took piano lessons. I tend to think that I fought my piano teacher to the death. And one of the stupider things I've done in my life. I mean, I would love to be able to play the piano. I feel very limited by only having one instrument. So there's the music, and then my parents were very socially conscious and politically active. Pop was the rabbi at Penn State, so we were in the middle of nowhere, and we were on the edge of the hard coal fields, the anthracite fields. But one of my favorite memories is, there was a point in Big Ten football where the teams, this is so hard to remember or even to believe, the teams were all white. The football teams were all white. The basketball teams were all white. And at a certain point, I don't know historically when it came, somewhere in the 50s, one of the Big Ten schools started raiding the historically black colleges and universities, the HBCUs. And so, for example, Grambling State, the Grambling Tigers, Louisiana, one of the great football schools, they started losing their football players to Big Ten. And I imagine this. I hope there's a book about this, or if not, I hope somebody reads it. The sort of the role of athletics in creating integration at many different levels. But I assume that at some point, the powers that be at Penn State said, well, we really aren't crazy about integrating, but we are even less crazy about losing to Michigan State. And they brought in some extraordinary players. The two who were all Americans, one was Jesse Ardell, and the other was Roosevelt, aka Rosie Greer. Now, if you've been to Penn State anytime in recent memory, in this little mountain valley, in the upper end of the Appalachians, the Allegheny Mountains, they've managed to cram 45,000 students and 45,000 townspeople. They spill over into the surrounding communities. When I was a kid growing up, I was born in 44, but so in the 40s and the 50s, I think the college had maybe 6,000 to 8,000 people, the same in the town. It was a small place. And we only had 2 barbershops, and each had 2 seats. And the barbers said, we are not prejudiced. We have nothing against Black people, called Negroes in those days, but we just weren't trained in how to cut that kind of hair, so therefore we won't, right? Pop gathered the other ministers in town and picketed the barbershops. Mom, who didn't drive, apparently my sister says she had a driver's license. I never saw her drive. She got a neighbor to drive her to Tyrone, which was a paper mill town about, maybe 30 miles away, but an hour across the mountains. And here's my mom, who was, quite proper at all. She was a rabbi's wife. She was nicely dressed. She walks into a Black barbershop. And they must have thought, what is going on today, right? And explained the situation to the barber and said, if you will come to State College like twice a month, I will set up a chair in my kitchen and you can cut the hair of these Black students, right? So, that was, I think, some really profound lessons. And I like that they had different approaches to political action. One is more assertive. My mom is, okay, we got a problem, let's solve the problem. Right? The other thing I think that really shaped me was the Holocaust. That, I was born in 1944, and I know that we had some 40 family members murdered. That does have an impact on you. I remember one of my strongest childhood memories is we would sit looking at photographs in the photo books, and I would say, who's that? To be a handsome woman dressed in black, and they would say, oh, that's your great grandmother. And I'm like, well, where is she now? And they said, we don't know. The letters stopped coming in 1943. And so I think there was at least, Steve, in my memory, just a great silence in the Jewish community and in the American community. I mean, we lost Christian soldiers and soldiers of every faith in the Great War. And I think we were all, frankly, in shock. I think the country was in shock. I think the Jewish community particularly was in shock. But of course, anybody who lost a daughter, a son, it was all, and it certainly wasn't all only Jews who died at the hands of the Nazis. So I know that shaped my sense of danger, and this, Steve, this is what I say today. If somebody were to ask, and sometimes if they don't ask, I say, as a Jew in America, I am not at risk of physical harm in any way close to what African Americans, particularly African American men, are. Nowhere near what the violence against immigrants, against LGBTQ people. But I am not immune. I am on the list. And I see this these days with you look at the Tree of Life, a massacre in Pittsburgh that a crazy right-wing gunman walks into a synagogue and murders 9 people. And in Charleston, South Carolina, a crazy right-wing lunatic walks into a church, pretends to pray, and then murders 9 people. I mean, this is so I believe that this was a preconditioning for my life as a civil rights union and community organizer. I think because I do feel that if fascism gets started, authoritarianism gets started in this country, and I think if the forces of the right are allowed to murder and to beat and to in every way endanger people of color and gays and lesbians and transgender people, I think eventually they'll get around to us Jews. So I'm not fighting on anybody else's barricade. I'm fighting for my own.
So so on that topic, you were talking about your father's social activism as a rabbi. And I remember you telling a story once about your father kind of getting annoyed with you for suggesting that he was a political activist. Can you elucidate that?
It was in a concert. I did a concert in, I think it was one of the ones in Washington. And afterward, and Pop, for a guy of his generation, born in 1913, a Depression kid from a very poor family, he was unusually physically affectionate, always come by and give me a hug. And, even when he was 85 and had Parkinson's, he'd lift me in the air when he saw me, And this time he was sort of cold. I'm like, hey, Pop, what's the matter? He said, you referred to me, you made me sound like a political activist. I am not a political activist. And I said, well, look, I hate it that I hurt your feelings. I'm really sorry. I said, but let me just check a story with you and you tell me if it's true. I told him the story about picketing the barber shop. He said, yeah, no, that's completely true. Me and Luther Harshbarger, the Lutheran minister, you can tell when somebody's named Luther, they're probably a Lutheran, right? He said, oh yeah, we did that. We can go up and down on this. I said, Pop, picketing on the main street of town, with other members of the clergy, with picket signs, you don't consider that being political? He said, oh no, absolutely not. I said, well, what do you consider? He said, it's just doing what's right. I like that. I do like that. But I disagree. It's political, Pop. I'm sorry,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so I mean, we'll follow the political thread for another minute, and I'll ask you to talk about your experiences with SNCC, because I think that's an interesting aspect of your career that a lot of people in music don't know about.
I was modestly involved in civil rights support work in college at Harvard, and I don't know if I think there is a contemporary parallel in the Black Lives Matter marches that everybody wants to be a part of them. I found it incredibly moving. In Charlotte, We had major marches, but in the surrounding towns that were Klan strongholds not that long ago, you had white high school kids organizing mostly white marches. I think it's extraordinary. So I think today it's just a wonderful thing to do. And you want to be a part of it. You want to be able to say, I was there. And that's how I felt about going south, you know? It was also, by the way, the cool thing to do, you know. It was, yeah, yes, there's political dedication. Yes, wow, I just want to be there. My parents said, no, you're not allowed to go. And, you know, they said, look, we don't want you to get killed. You know, I thought they were being really stupid. You know, today with 3 kids and 3 grandkids, I'm willing to grant that they had a point. And I think it wasn't more than a week after my 21st birthday, I felt liberated, and I went south and enjoyed SNCC. I was in Forest City, Arkansas, which was named after the Confederate cavalry leader, slave owner, and slave trader, General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was also the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. That's not a very good start for a town's reputation or social relations. And you know, Steve, sometimes I don't know sort of when I say this, but I certainly say to myself, this is just true for me. It is always 1965. It's always Forest City, Arkansas. It's always SNCC. That's the defining moment of my life. Up until that point, I had no idea whatsoever what I wanted to do with my life. I really didn't. And in that summer, I realized I wanted to be something I hadn't even known existed. I wanted to be an organizer for justice. And 55 years later, that's still what I am. I still do this every day. I still am involved in campaigns. You know, last night I was working on, you know, how do we get young people to turn out, you know, for the Georgia Senate elections, and corresponding with, you know, a young kid at Harvard named Zvi Shapiro, who's created a national movement that I can't remember the name of exactly, but that's managing to register young people nonpartisanly at rapid rate, and saying, how could I be helpful, and sending them songs from Folk Vote, which my music manager and longtime friend Art Menius and I organized to use the power of music and musicians to get people to register and vote this year. So SNCC was absolutely transformative for me. I had
What exactly were you doing in Forest City with SNCC?
Okay, so this is interesting. We were dealing in Forest City with the usual. There were 4 department stores. It was a town of about 12,000 people, and in the Mississippi River Delta, but on the Arkansas side, 45 miles west of Memphis. In those days, via US 70. I don't know what the interstate is now. So the first demand, as it was in so many places, was, look, your business flourishes because of your African-American customers. So you need to hire some African-Americans up front, not just in the stock room, you know, not just cleaning up after the store closes, but running the cash registers. And so, and again, I think the same mix of practicality that I saw in my parents' approach to the segregated barbershops. On the one hand, we boycotted one of the 4 stores. I learned that you don't boycott everything because you want to divide the opposition, you know, and we had training sessions in how to run a cash register in the Freedom Center, so we could say, hey, this woman knows how to run a cash register. Check her out. And here is the complexity. In the strategic discussions, leading up to which of the 4 stores we would boycott and picket. They decided to boycott and picket the one Jewish-owned store. And I am sitting there not knowing what I think about this. Because on a strategic level, I agree. That the 3 Christian-owned stores are more likely to act in solidarity with each other. They would have been perfectly happy that it wasn't them, but I knew there would be some secret satisfaction. Well, that's what these people have coming to them. And I did not speak up. And to this day, I don't know whether I should have. I really don't know whether I should have. But it was painful to me, even while I recognized that it was the right strategic decision. And it was the right strategic decision. I mean, there's a wonderful book called The Jew Store about how the pack peddlers that came to this country eventually settled in towns and opened a store. There's a wonderful PBS film called Delta Jews, obviously a part on Delta Blues. It says the story of the South, of the Jewish South, is of fathers who built stores for sons who did not want to run them. We will note the gendered framing of this. And it is also just true that the Jewish stores flourished because they had most of them had a different attitude towards African Americans. They were not native white Southerners. They didn't grow up they grew up as the recipient of that kind of prejudice and racism in Europe. And so they tended to treat Black customers with a little more respect. They tended to give credit where the Christian-owned stores would not give credit. So maybe there was some calculation, which I think accurately, that they would be more likely to hire African Americans to run the cash registers. This is complex.
Yeah.
But yeah, I literally did not know that there were people called organizers who did this, who brought people together. I didn't know that. I did not know that. And boy, I sure learned it fast. And I just thought that's what I want to do. And it's still what I want to do. I love organizing. I love doing it. It's you get to be with people in that moment when they become who they've always dreamed of being and thought they could never be. And you're there when a woman that you've sat with at her house, you door knocked her, and you say, could you come to the meeting? No, I'm scared. I can't come to the meeting. And I just don't do it. My husband will be angry with me. And then 2 years later, she's saying, sisters, stand up. We can fight back. We can do this. And you think, wow, I think it's beautiful. And I also think it's necessary. I am not a fan of top-down organizations and elites. And I'm certainly not a fan of fascism. I'm not going to mention any countries that have been in danger of fascism lately, but I love the idea that people work together to change things, and maybe that's why one of the recent things I love about music, that there's a community that that 4 people get together and they form a band and they do it together. It's just beautiful. So other things in SNCC is that because I grew up where I grew up, I have a lot of skills that the volunteers who came from wonderful places like Massachusetts and California and New York, from Brooklyn, they didn't know how to fix cars. They didn't know how to do carpentry. They didn't know plumbing and electrical wiring. I know all that stuff. My skills are rusty, but I'm still pretty good at all these things. And so what I did in SNCC and why they recruited me to come south is so that, I could help keep the cars running. And I could, for our city, for example, Mrs. Florence Clay in the days when all women had the first name Mrs. You probably remember that. But she owned the funeral home and the nice new brick funeral home where I stayed and slept and was sometimes called on to help when there was a really heavy body that needed to be moved. Very interesting lodging situation. But the old funeral home, which was wooden and had been abandoned for years, was sitting there empty. And she said, look, you want to fix it up? It could be our Freedom Center. So that's what I did in SNCC. I at the beginning, I just helped fix up the Freedom Center and built tables and library shelves and help get the toilets working. You can't have a movement without toilets. You really can't. Don't forget that. And then, because again, to go back to State College, I went to a consolidated school that served much of this primarily rural county. And Steve, it's such a long time ago, and I don't trust my memory even of much more recent things. But I'm pretty sure that something like 1/4 of the kids in the school came an hour early so they could wash up and get a meal. Yeah. So I grew up with a lot of poor white folks. The county was almost 100% white, and certainly State College was. And I am comfortable in that kind of society. So, whereas, and I don't mean any disrespect, but where so many of the white SNCC volunteers couldn't imagine walking into a hillbilly bar, I was perfectly at home. By then I was playing music and I, knew Hank Williams songs and in those days I fished. I didn't hunt. It's not a Jewish thing. You don't say, hey, after services, let's go out and bag us a couple of bucks. There are exceptions like Dr. Al, who just ran for the U.S. Senate in Alaska. He was an obstetrician. My understanding is they had to fly a rabbi in from Oakland for his bar mitzvah, and he's a commercial fisherman and killed a grizzly bear. I think that's pretty cool. I'm sorry he didn't win. I contributed to his campaign, but also because, as you know, I still spending time in working in Alaska, trying to stop the proposed Pebble Mine. We may or may not get to that. So the African American leaders of Arkansas SNCC, who were just extraordinarily wise and politically savvy, knew that there was no way that Black people could ever take over government in the state. That was a possibility in Mississippi. That was a possibility in South Carolina. The two states in our country that have had a African American majority, right? But Arkansas was maybe 20% Black at the most. So they knew that down the road they would have to have coalitions with white working class organizations. And so they asked me if I would go up into the Ozarks and see if I could lay some groundwork. There was a fight over a proposed dam on the 11-Point River. They said, why don't you go up there and see if you can't get some action going? Theoretically, a wonderful idea. I had no idea what it meant to organize. I had no skills whatsoever in that area. I was in a car that was known to every Arkansas State Patrolman and every Klan member. So after 2 weeks of sheer terror, I came back to Forest City. But the lesson is there. The lesson is there that you need to overcome those divisions. I believe in what some people call separatist organizing, which is to say, yeah, you need to come into a coalition with a power base. You don't just ask an individual person to represent whatever group they belong to. There needs to be an organization that comes in there. But then eventually, we need to build powerful organizations that cross religious lines, racial lines, ethnic lines, regional lines. That's where power is. And that's what I saw in my many years with the labor movement, and in my knowledge of the history of the labor movement. It is that kind of building across the lines that divide us that creates real power. When I was working for the Textile Workers Union, I spent a year trying to organize the Cleveland cloth plant in Shelby, North Carolina, where the Earl Scruggs Museum is today. By the way, I really just shout out to everybody. If you're ever anywhere near Charlotte, make a side trip to Shelby. It is a great museum, the Earl Scruggs Museum, because it puts Earl, who was a political progressive, in the context of his times. And there's a very honest racial history, a very honest union history. One of the things I had never seen is that they had tear gas guns that were assigned to the managers of the mills in case they needed to use them. I had never seen that. I didn't know that. So yeah, but I remember when I was working in Shelby, the plant was about, about 40% African American. The mill owners knew that by and large, African American workers were going to vote for the union. So they made sure that there was never an African American majority in a plant. So, I'm the only organizer out there. There's about 500 workers. And the white people are saying to me, hey, you know what? We don't need, we really don't want to be in an organization with black people. Our kids are going to get teased at school. It's just, let's just have a white union. Isn't that okay, Si? No problem. And the black workers are saying, hey, Si, these white workers, man, they're racist to the core, They won't even speak to us, and we're the majority, we're the people supporting the union. Why are you talking to them? And I would say, guys, I hate to tell you this, but my union, the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, doesn't support that attitude. We believe that working people are the core, and that we don't do things that divide racially. I said, but the other thing is completely practical. Hey, white workers, you're a majority of the plant, but half of you are anti-union, So there's no way. You got to get a majority vote. And I say to them, and they're like, and I said to the black workers, they would say, no, Si, we are the majority of the plant. I'm like, no, guys, I have what's called the Excelsior list. It's the list of everybody who works in the plant. I say, no, it's I could tell you exactly the number, and you could argue with me, but you don't have a majority. So like it or not, you got to work together. We didn't organize the plant, but that's part of the stubbornness of an organizer. You have to say, no, there's some things that we're not going to do, and there's some things that we are going to do.
Right. So when you were doing so I should say, for the purposes of the transcript, that when we talk about SNCC, we're talking about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was an important organization during the civil rights movement. And the thing about SNCC, of course, is that there was also a lot of music involved in a lot of SNCC activism. Was that something that you encountered during your time with them as well? Music within the movement?
Steve, evil that I am, I'm tempted to say, no, I didn't hear any music. Just to add that SNCC was really the youth wing of the civil rights movement.
Right.
And, almost everybody in it was late teens, early 20s. And we also, because I do think of it as a we, and I was signed up to go to the 60th reunion in Washington this spring, and, along comes this virus. So, but I hope to be there next year. So, that SNCC believed that you live with the people and you work with the people in a very immediate way. You don't I have nothing but respect and gratitude to the organizations that did primarily media work, that did primarily work with religious organizations, that worked for legislation. My mother's older brother, actually, yeah, because she had two brothers. I'm always confused by that. Whose name was Arnold Aronson. Together with Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, and with A. Philip Randolph, who was the president of the union known as the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
Mm-hmm.
And the sleeping car porters were African Americans. He's one of our great labor leaders. The three of them, when they were, I guess, in their early 30s, co-founded the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which was then and is today the largest civil rights coalition in the country. And A. Philip Randolph chaired the board, and my Uncle Arnie was the executive director for like 30, 40 years. And he actually worked for the National Jewish Community Advisory Council out of New York, but they loaned him to the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. So he would come down Sunday night. He would come down. He always stayed with us, and then Friday night he would go back to his family in Rye, New York. And so I had an inside view of the civil rights movement at the national level that few people, would have. And because he didn't have a car, so I was always delegated to pick him up after work. And so I was my mom's younger brother, my Uncle Charlie, his spouse, Reba Aronson, was a nurse in World War II. I don't know whether she was in a combat zone, but she died much younger than she should have, and Charlie gave me her 53 Chevy. So, my uncle already would call me up and he'd say, "Hey, cuz, time to come get me." So I would, drive my raggedy old 53 Chevy down to the Sheraton Hotel with a great sweeping, circular porch. And I would get into the line of limousines, and, and the livery driver would get out and say, "Vice President Hubert Humphrey," and Hubert would come out and get into the car. And then they say, "Next, I don't know, James Farmer, head of the Congress of Racial Equality." And, Mr. Farmer would get into the limousine, and I'd get out and say, "My uncle, Artie Aronson." He'd come in and say, "Hey, cuz." He'd open the door to a 53 Chevy, and I'd drive him home. But it meant that I had an inside view of a lot of it. And I mean, I do, Steve, I am proud of the way in which my family on both sides is so public spirited. The children of my first cousins are teachers. They're social workers. Not everybody, but by and large, we do a tradition of public service, and that the fact that fact is really influences my life. I sometimes say that we act in ways that we hope our grandmother will be proud of us,
Right.
and my family respects the work that we do. My first cousin Gila Aronson every day drove 30 miles to teach a special education class, and retired at a union pension. And her two daughters, one's an accountant for nonprofits, one's an emergency room nurse. So I mean, I like this. I like this tradition, and I like being a part of it.
All right. Well, thank you.